So welcome to everybody to this international online conference on theological genealogies of modernity. Please accept warm words of welcome from the my co-organizer, Darren Sarisky, Joe Rasmussen, and myself. Thank you for coming to this event, which has been sponsored by various bodies that I'd like to acknowledge at the beginning of this session. So we've kindly received support from the John Fell Fund at the University of Oxford, as well as sponsored by the Genealogies of Modernity project, the Collegium Institute for Catholic Thought and Practice, the Beatrice Institute, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we're very grateful for all the support that we received for putting up this event. This event is centered around a hope that we would like to start a conversation about theological genealogies of modernity as a genre of writing, as a genre of historical writing. And this writing poses questions about the origin and the source of our modern condition, the cultural condition that our society is in today. And today we have 3 papers which will touch upon various aspects of these genealogies. Especially some of the papers will address some of these macro narratives, which display what we have termed fall or decline shape. And these papers today will all contribute to a conversation about how these narratives today can situate theology into our understanding of modernity. Just to explain a little bit about the conference logistics at the beginning, each of the sessions in this conference will be 1 hour long. And for the first 15 minutes, we'll have a presentation from the speaker. And then we'll have a respondent giving a direct response to the speaker for about 15 minutes. And then we will include all the panelists on the day, all the speakers who are contributing either as a speaker or a respondent to have a discussion. And then finally, we'll receive questions from the floor. But I would encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A chat function as soon as they come to you, as it will be really helpful for our conference assistant to process them, so that there'll be good time for me as the chair to address these questions to our speakers. After each session, we'll have a 5-minute break, which we'll then reconvene after that. So without further ado, I will now introduce our first speaker, Professor Brad Gregory, holds the Dorothy Griffin Collegiate Chair in European History at the University of Notre Dame. His research interests center on Christianity in the Reformation era and the long-term consequences of this era in the making of the modern Western world. His book, Unintended Reformation, published in 2011, offers one of the most intensely debated theological genealogies of modernity, having received many reviews and discussions in academic journals and online forums. And we're most grateful to Professor Gregory's willingness to open our conference with a paper entitled, "Is Impending Global Environmental Catastrophe a Sufficient Criterion for a Declension Macro Narrative?" I hand over to you, Brad.
Thanks so much, Pui. I'm laughing only because your very reserved way of introducing me and then hearing the title of my paper at the end of that, I just thought, well, okay, yeah, there's nothing like starting off with a bang, right? I want to thank all the organizers for the invitation and for organizing the conference. I know this has been a long time in the making, much longer than any of us wanted to, but I really appreciate your persistence, and I'm delighted to be here this morning. I'm going to offer a few kind of preliminary framing remarks by way of sort of background for the paper, which is part of a much bigger enterprise, and that's what I want to make clear. And then I'll say a few things about the paper itself in relationship to that undertaking. So preliminarily then, and this will sound deflationary based on the theme of the conference, but I just want to be clear about where I stand with respect to the notion of genealogies. I really don't have any investment in or concerns with traditions of or academic debates about the criteria for genealogical history or genealogies per se. So whether or not, I'm not doing what Nietzsche does or Foucault or Schmidt or whatever is really a matter of indifference to me. I did not become a methodological convert to genealogy and then set about trying to figure out how to do it in some or other way. But my concern has been and remains trying to understand how we have arrived at the present as we know it. The present is the product of the past. I think that's fairly uncontroversial. And so what in the past should we attend to in order to explain what it is that we want to understand? What aspects of the past, when and where, combined and understood in what ways with respect to one another, have the most explanatory power in accounting for our current institutional, ideological, material, political, economic, cultural, environmental realities, in connection with one another, of course, because that's how the real world is. It's not separated according to the way that we organize academic disciplines or periods of history. Now, it became rather disconcerting to me then some years ago when I realized that my own discipline of history, the one dedicated to the study of the human past, is not set up very well to deal with this question because of the ways in which historians are trained. We're trained as specialists in small slices of space and time with respect to certain aspects of the human past at the expense of others. And especially problematic, in addition to this, was an extraordinarily deeply embedded assumption in the dominant macro narrative about Western modernity, built as it is on a medieval versus modern binary. Way in the back past there was a past transcended dead world. Now we live in a present relevant live world, one of the corollaries of which de facto overwhelmingly has been that modern historians need not concern themselves with the pre-modern transcended deep human past. Explaining the present historically led me to see that genealogy can be a useful metaphor for trying to grasp and convey how changes that occurred further back than the near past, than the modern era, still remain relevant for understanding the world today. So in other words, I came to genealogy as a corollary of what I've called in the Unintended Reformation and elsewhere, anti-supersessionist history. And supersessionist history being history understood as a series of over and done, discrete, left behind stages. It's assumed by most historians, it's assumed by most other scholars in other disciplines, and I think it's assumed by most people in general because of the kind of cultural osmotic effect, more than any explicit enculturation into the dominant macro narrative of modernity. The accelerating rapidity of change in the modern era reinforces this impression, I think, a supersessionist conception of history. I regard it as an obfuscation that in fact conceals from us a proper, adequate understanding of the changes over time that have led to where we find ourselves today. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, I pursued this approach with respect to the unintended consequences of the doctrinal disagreements and the religio-political conflicts of the Reformation era, arguing, among other things, that our current values pluralism, or what I call in the book hyperpluralism, and unstable conflictual disagreements over matters of value, meaning, purpose, and so forth, very much in a McIntyrean vein, are the long-term unintended outcome of the unresolved religious disagreements of the 16th and the 17th centuries above all. Modern liberalism deliberately provides no substantive answers to these questions, and reason alone in modern philosophy since the 17th century gives us no reason to think that it's capable of answering them either in anything like a consensually persuasive manner. So what happened 5 centuries ago in Western Christianity helps to explain a great deal about the character of the present, even though this is not obvious at first sight. And so therefore we need complex arguments that have to be unfolded in multi-stranded historical genealogies in which not just theology, but also religion, not just high intellectual history, but also lived Christianity, institutions, the exercise of power, etc., have to be understood. My claim is we can't well understand the character of our present situation unless we take this on board in a serious way. So last year, the year when everything melted down for everybody, I was happily ensconced for 3 months before it all went haywire at the University of Otago in Dunedin, New Zealand, as the invited Burns lecturer. And I was supposed to give 6 lectures in May of last year. Those have been put on hold. I had also, in the summer of 2019, been part of a workshop at the University of Chicago about the Anthropocene epoch and history. And that was when I started really immersing myself in scholarship about the Anthropocene in our current environmental situation. So I was working on my lectures for Otago on this theme: fallen world, failing planet, the early modern roots of the Anthropocene. I was thinking to expand some of the ideas and fill out some of the arguments from the Unintended Reformation's 5th chapter, Manufacturing the Goods Life. The basic argument was that all of the key components that have contributed to the end of the Holocene epoch were already in place before the Industrial Revolution started. I mentioned these 4 briefly in my paper for today: a Baconian instrumentalism regarding the natural world, the pursuit of open-ended, self-chosen individual desires, political liberalism to protect institutionally those desires, and competitive, commercial, belligerent nation states operating on a global stage. Then COVID happened, everything changed. I had to come back to the United States. I set aside the lectures for the time being. I kept reading widely. I started thinking even more broadly about changes over time and what had led to the Anthropocene. I read a lot of anthropology, a lot of archaeology, and thought about ways in which the disciplinary divides between these pursuits and history, as well as, of course, their separation from theology. I mean, that goes without saying in the current configuration of the academy, that these disciplinary divides are not conducive either to the pursuit of theology in its broadest traditional sense of God in relation to all things. Far too much, I think, of what we do and how we're trained is self-truncated, it's cramped, and it's inimical to seeing changes over time in human beings as Homo sapiens sapiens in relationship to the natural world in ways that are sufficient to understand ourselves and our current situation. So to speak very explicitly theologically for a moment, if Christ is indeed the Lord of heaven and earth, as Christians claim, then as the second person of the Trinity, he was certainly also the Lord of heaven and earth throughout all of planetary and hominid evolution. That is what we call in theology creation. Not to mention the Lord of the exquisitely gifted cave painters of Lascaux or Chauvet in southern France, Altamira in northern Spain, or Sulawesi in Indonesia, tens of thousands of years ago, all of whom were embodied souls created by God just as much as has been every other human being, notwithstanding, of course, their quite different relationship to salvation history as understood in either Jewish or Christian terms. So I started how to think then, how to think about tens of thousands of years of anthropogenic changes in relationship to our new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. I'm not so focused on when did it start. That's not my main concern. But again, how did we arrive at where we are today? There's no question, I think this is absolutely indisputable and uncontroversial, that modern global modernity comes overwhelmingly from Western Europe, from between the late 15th and the 19th centuries, whether we're talking politically, militarily, economically, ideologically, and that this has nothing to do with a Eurocentric or a Western bias. To Western Europe that colonized and incorporated huge swaths of the rest of the world into its empires, subjecting millions of other people to the political will of its nation states, and not the other way around. Whatever the specifics of the details, there's simply no denying this. Nor is there any denying that all of the major players in this process, Spain and Portugal at first, then joined by France, the Dutch Republic, and then England and into Britain, were overwhelmingly Christian countries that were at odds with one another in a whole host of ways. This overlaps with and extends later than the Reformation era and the colonizing, imperializing, extractive expansion of Western Europe. So bizarre as it sounds, and you know, what are you going to do? What are you going to do for an encore, right? What began to coalesce around the beginning of the new year was a project that, as I said to one colleague, sort of despite myself, all my projects impose themselves on me. Nobody would ever choose to do this. You'd be thought crazy, but probably am anyway. It's going to make the Unintended Reformation look like a microhistory. It's an account of how the human past became the human present on our planet that starts sufficiently far back so as to preclude any reasonable objections that I haven't gone back far enough, and that ends with the Anthropocenic present. So then my premise, again, this is what's meant to be uncontroversial. Again, I think it's trivial, but okay, let's be safe. that a world peopled entirely by hunter-gatherers never could have led the planet into the Anthropocene. So I'm starting at the end of the last ice age, 11,700 or so BC, the beginning of the Holocene, and I'll take the analysis up to the present. With this twist, this is a history of Christianity, with Jesus of Nazareth at its historical and analytical center. His birth of a woman in Judea, coming in the early years of ancient Southwest Eurasia's apex predator regime, namely the Roman Empire, as the historically contextualized referent of Paul's fullness of time in Galatians 4:4. This is a world already ancient, with a much longer stretch between the first Mesopotamian city-state of Uruk, circa 3400 BC, and Jesus than it is from Jesus up to the present. And from the get-go, it's a world characterized by civilization, whether we're talking Sumeria, the Egyptian dynasties, Akkad, Ur-3, the second millennium BC kingdoms, the first millennium BC empires, Neo-Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, Persian, Athenian, Roman, all of which are marked by coerced labor, titanic inequalities utterly unlike anything known in a world of hunter-gatherers, in ways that damage the vast majority of human lives. In all of these regimes, the concentration of power and wealth meant essentially fortunes for the few and misfortunes for the many. In other words, the way of the world. In contrast to which, Jesus proclaims something altogether different, the kingdom of God, a kingdom not of this world, that is, not at all like the values and the character of this world as it existed, but absolutely concerned with the suffering, the mistreatment, and the inhibited flourishing of the embodied souls living in it. The perverse values and priorities of this world, with those who pursue vastly more than they need, while others lack even the little that they need to flourish. Hence, love one another as I have loved you. Hence, Matthew 25, by far the most explicit passage in the Gospels with respect to eternal judgment by God, based on whether or not we provide for the most basic needs of fellow human beings who lack them: food, drink, clothing, welcome, and basic care. That is, love one another. Which brings me to this essay. It's a very compressed attempt to convey something of what I'm up to with respect to the theme of our conference, trying to get across in a few thousand words what is eventually going to take me many hundreds of pages. Half of the 12 projected chapters of the book will be a history of Christianity in context under the rubric, at least provisionally, evasive maneuvers: Christianity and civilization from the Roman Empire to the Anthropocene. The fundamental argument is what I asserted in the paper for today and what I will show in considerable detail in the book, namely that based on what the New Testament says, Jesus told his followers clearly and starkly what to do and how to live with respect to material possessions, the pursuit of wealth, and acquisitiveness. The vast majority of Christians have not done that, but have instead found ways to ignore, downplay, rationalize, or evade what he said in order to get on with their lives. By the way, I include myself completely in that description. No exemption here. We should never avoid analysis just because we find ourselves implicated in it. This was as evident in late antique or medieval Christianity as it would be among early modern or modern Christians, but in very different ways and with different consequences because of two major things. First, the confessional conflicts of the Reformation era, because they provide such a powerful cross-confessional impetus to the legitimation of acquisitiveness, radically at odds with the gospel. Not coincidentally, in an era of Western European global extraction, expansion, and domination. The second is British imperial domination after the Napoleonic Wars, combined with the British lead and European spread of industrialization since 1800. This leads to an altogether disproportionate environmental impact of Western European and diversely Western Christian countries in precipitating the Anthropocene. All while its protagonists, of course, were convinced that they were guided by providence, doing God's will, spreading civilization, and so forth. In the briefest terms, then, Jesus' message was an intervention that sought to humanize civilization in an already ancient, thoroughly inhumane, radically unjust, and unequal world by preaching a kingdom of God with real-life implications based on values not of this world. Christians overwhelmingly have not done what he said because it's incredibly daunting and radical. And now literally everyone in the world, in very disparate ways because of extreme inequalities, is facing the consequences. This sort of a hermeneutic of the New Testament, with its particular emphasis on the significance of money, wealth, possessions, acquisitiveness, and ascetic self-denial, is not intended to be a comprehensive theology or a Christology or interpretation of the New Testament. It is deliberately chosen because of its explanatory power with respect to changes over time in ways that help us understand the present. The evasion, the avoidance of this recurrent emphasis in the New Testament is what gives us powerful analytical leverage in understanding both the history of Christianity and the advent of the Anthropocene. And so I suppose it qualifies then as a theological genealogy of modernity, although again, I'm unconcerned if it doesn't seem to meet criterion X or Y according to whatever model. Paradoxically, and in my view, tragically, the truth of Christ's message seems disturbingly evident in the cumulative deleterious effects of the extent of its avoidance and evasion by Christians themselves over the past 2 millennia. Sorry for going over a bit, but that's it.
Thank you very much, Brad, for your hugely ambitious project and giving us an insight. And without further ado, I'll now ask Peter Harrison to give a response. I'll briefly introduce Peter, who is a professorial fellow at the University of Queensland Institute of Advanced Studies in Humanities. And he works in intellectual history, especially in science and religion. So I can't think of any better person than Peter to respond to Brad's hugely ambitious project of combining theological ideas and analysis and historical development. Thank you, Peter.
Great. Look, thanks, Pui, for that introduction, and thanks to you and Darren too for organising this conference, which I think is based on a terrific premise, and I'm really happy to be part of it. Also happy to be commenting on Brad's paper. I think Brad's work, and he's partly set this out in his own remarks, is kind of emblematic of the sort of work we need more of in history, the sort of work that is not prepared to paint a big picture and to make bold, controversial claims. And these kinds of works are really crucial, I think, because even if we don't disagree with them, and I find myself more in agreement with Brad than disagreement, but even if we don't agree with them, they're fruitful because they're generative of what I think are very helpful kinds of discussions. And I know Brad's work has been instrumental in, I think, inspiring the premises of this particular conference. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing how it pans out over the next few days. Now, I want to begin with my remarks with a brief summary of the argument that Brad gives in the paper, which is somewhat more constricted than the overview that he's presented us with here. And I originally said to Brad that I'd have a summary and 4 questions. I've actually got a 5th question now, and I'll put that up front and I won't say any more about it. But that question, Brad, is who is the audience for this book? And so I'll leave it right there. Who is it that you're seeking to persuade? The second question I have, and I'll expand on these as we go, is what the overall meta-ethical frame that you're operating from is, because at times it seems to me to be consequentialist. Not that that's necessary. Well, I think it is a bad thing, but it's not a consequentialist approach. It's not completely in accordance with, say, virtue or deontological approaches, which are traditionally associated with Christian ethics. The second issue is whether the package of modernity that you describe, all of those elements can be separated out so that we might, as it were, exonerate at least some aspects of modernity, the good bits, for example, like, liberalism and rights, and set aside the bad bits. So the third question is whether it's really about your commitment to a particular version of Christian ethics, and indeed an implicit political philosophy there. And I'd like to hear more about that. What your commitments in theological anthropology and eschatology are, because I think that we can't simply read off ethics from a direct reading of the New Testament in the way I think you do, but neither of us, as we've agreed, are New Testament exegetes. So I'd like to hear others on this topic as well. And then finally, I'm not going to talk about any of this in any detail, but these are just things occurred to me that would a Marxist critique work in much the same way as your critique of capitalism would work, looking beyond the West. And you've actually made reference to this, why not invoke indigenous value systems or other non-Western conceptions of nature, as opposed to a specific Christian message to address what's the fundamental problem of the Anthropocene, which is anthropogenic climate change. So to go to then a summary of your paper, the central question that you're exploring in the paper is whether the notion of the Anthropocene, and more specifically the fact of anthropogenic climate change and an impending global crisis, falsifies the dominant, relatively optimistic, progressive macro narrative. And I think the paper makes an excellent case that they do, that you have falsified in important respects that narrative. And in that case, job done. But to say more about this, your argument, in addition to simply pointing out the downsides of industrial and scientific progress, you argue that these downsides are not easily extricated from other elements of the standard progressive macro narrative. Of these, the most pertinent is the liberal assumption that progress entails facilitation of the pursuit of, and I'm quoting from your paper here, self-chosen individual desires that are to take place within legal frameworks of politically protected individual rights that enable open-ended and ever-increasing prosperity, end of quote. So, as you argue, the more we advance this liberating agenda, the more we exacerbate the problem, as the increasing pursuit of these self-chosen desires on your model necessarily leads to increasing, quote, fossil-fueled capitalist consumerism that threatens to consume us all. Again, quoting there. Now, I think this last point is a really crucial one, a really key one. One of the reasons that decline narratives have generated controversy is that they challenge cherished notions of liberalism and the values that sustain it. Decline narratives, and I take this to be the dominant form of theological genealogies, seem to render a normative judgment on this central feature of Western modernity, prompting resistance and even outrage from those for whom such critiques seem to threaten individual freedoms and rights, and indeed individuals' identity as enlightened, rational, secular individuals, which is how people in the modern academy tend to identify themselves. Now, those willing to admit that the dominant positive macro narrative has downsides typically assume that these are outweighed by the goods of modernity, not just material goods, but crucially political freedoms and rights that many of us now enjoy. And this is what Brad refers to as the all things considered argument. All things considered, we're better off with the situation we have now. In insisting that there's an intrinsic link between a looming environmental catastrophe, which no sane person thinks is a good thing, Brad seeks to rule out this all things considered argument by tipping the balance decisively in the direction of the downsides. If capitalism, rights and freedoms agenda, if that's what puts us on the path to environmental catastrophe, then the all things considered argument fails, and prognoses will need to look beyond technical fixes to the ideological bases of our modern predicament. And Brad also draws attention to other downsides that tend to be glossed over in the macro histories, posing the who benefited question, hence slavery, colonisation, the virtual genocide of Indigenous peoples, all of which are built in on his model to this modern macro narrative, but as I say, tending to be glossed over. Now, at this point, let me offer a tentative observation that wasn't obvious in Brad's presentation, but it came across to me this way in the paper, and I might have been wrong in this, but here goes. Brad's argument at certain points seems to admit of a kind of consequentialist reading, and I'm going to state this in very crude terms, just so that we can see the point I'm attempting to make here. Granted that the consequence of the flourishing of individual freedoms and rights, the maximising of choices, and yes, consumerism too, given that the consequence of this is an environmental disaster, we need to curtail these things in order to save the world. Okay, that's the form of the consequentialist argument. But recall in this context, a kind of deontological perspective expressed hyperbolically in Kant's dictum, better the whole world should perish, the literal what's going to happen in this case, than that injustice be done. And I think that defenders of modernity could reasonably run that kind of line. Later in the paper, Brad offers this observation, and I'm quoting here, "It seems apparent that we're now seeing the effects of large numbers of people doing the opposite of what the New Testament says in respect of wealth and possessions." He speaks of, quote, "the long-term consequences of not leading aesthetic disciplined lives." Again, this has a consequentialist look to me, which would be inconsistent with an emphasis on virtues or duties and indeed rights. So my first question to Brad then is, what's the meta-ethical framing of the argument? Is it in fact a consequentialist argument? And is this consistent with the invocation later in the paper of what I take to be an advocacy of certain virtues or duties, which presumably would be cultivated irrespective of what their consequences were? The second question concerns where I think proponents of the progressivist meta-narratives would seek to push back. And I'm not sure whether this is my argument or not, but it seems to me the kind of objection that could be made. And this is to do with whether the whole package of secular modernity is as intimately and necessarily connected to the outcome of environmental exploitation as Brad suggests. While it seems undeniable that a looming environmental catastrophe gives us a prima facie reason to question the standard progress story, the issue of which features of secular modernity are inextricably implicated in this situation is arguably not quite as straightforward. And here the question is whether anthropogenic climate change is, as it were, just a bug in the system, or whether it's some kind of ineradicable flaw in the base set software, as it were, such that we have to throw out the whole model rather than tweak the system. So here's one possible way in which we might tweak the system, which Brad actually broaches in the paper, and I quote, that we have revolutionary, scalable and feasible technologies that fix the problem. So the theory here is that technology got us into the mess, science and technology got us into the mess, they can presumably get us out of it. Now, as Brad also notes, from a practical perspective, none of these technologies, whatever their promise, have been forthcoming. So nonetheless, this remains, I think, a theoretical possibility. I think more challenging to Brad's thesis of the necessary implications of liberalism in our present plight, the necessary implication of liberalism in our present plight, is indicated in the phrase fossil-fueled capitalist consumerism. And Brad makes an excellent case that capitalist consumerism is an inherent and inextricable part of the modern liberal package. But the fossil-fueled qualifier is not essential to that package. At a stretch, we could envisage, counterfactually, I think, an industrial revolution that relied on alternative, less environmentally problematic sources of energy. Indeed, this is the kind of future optimistically predicted by those wedded to the standard progressive macro narrative. Now, of course, this is not how it happened, but it could be argued that there is nothing intrinsic to capitalist consumerism per se that necessitates environmental degradation, at least at the level that triggers a potential environmental catastrophe. On this view, it was not solely that the particular constellation of values and institutions that inevitably led us to our present predicament, rather it was their combination with the contingent fact of our historical reliance on fossil fuels, along with facts about the physical chemistry of greenhouse gases. Individually, these historical conditions were each necessary, but only together were they necessary and sufficient. So it's not just a problem of values, it's a problem of values in conjunction with a particular set of historical facts, contingent facts. So while I'm mostly in agreement with Brad's historical analysis, and especially the role he gives to a kind of Baconian utilitarianism, distinguishing between these two necessary but insufficient conditions enables us to envisage two distinct solutions to our present predicament, each relating to one of the necessary conditions, either a relinquishment of the dominant model of capitalist liberalism, which was undoubtedly implicated, or a retention of that model, but with the relinquishment of reliance on non-renewable energy. Now, this is a very simplistic analysis, since the distinction I'm seeking to make is arguably confounded by a connection between these two variables in the form of an economic preference for fossil fuel energy on consumer capitalist grounds. But we can envisage situations in which there was no such economic preference. This counterfactual also brings us back to the issue of the meta-ethical framing of Brad's argument and whether there's an implicit consequentialism at work. Let's say that capitalist consumerism turned out not to have disastrous environmental consequences, that something like the invisible hand, which nicely harmonizes self-interested individual actions with greater social goods, turned out to be right. Would not human acquisitiveness and greed still be undesirable vices, irrespective of their benign consequences? Now, it's counterfactual, but you can see where I'm headed with that. This brings me to the third question, which concerns Brad's advocacy of the ethical message preached by Jesus in the Gospels. Now, my worry here is with, again, what seems to be a problematic amalgam of, on the one hand, an ethics of virtue or Christian duty, and on the other, a consequentialism that focuses on outcomes. So again, I come back to this question about what's the overall meta-ethical framework informing the analysis and the prescriptions? Is the argument that the practice of certain virtues or the exercise of proper duties of Christians will inevitably yield good outcomes? Or to put it in more starkly consequentialist terms, that if the outcome we seek is a situation in which neither the natural world nor its inhabitants are exploited to the point of ecological crisis, that we need to observe these duties and practice these virtues, because that's a consequentialist argument. What then are the unintended consequences? And Brad, you of all people know about these, and the objection against consequentialism that the practice of virtues and duties is not directed at particular ends, but these things are good in themselves. And this leaves open the possibility that the practice of the virtues or the performance of moral duties may not, in fact, yield optimal outcomes. Recall again Kant's anti-consequentialist principle, better the whole world should perish than injustice be done. So the potential for a mismatch between the practice of virtue and good social outcomes is arguably an implication of traditional conceptions of the fallen original sin, which not only counsel against the idea that there might be anything like a perfect performance of duty or a perfect embodiment of the virtues, but also implies that in a fallen world there will not be a perfect harmonization of good means and good ends. So I wonder if the missing piece here is that both deontological ethics and the moral teachings of the Gospels are to be understood in the light of eschatology. Kant's deontological ethic, for example, relies on an explicitly eschatological postulate that the coincidence of virtue and happiness can only be guaranteed in a world that lies beyond this one. And this enables us in our present state to deal with the empirical reality that good acts may have bad outcomes. In the case of New Testament ethical teaching, Jesus' parables about the kingdom of God and the moral order that operates there are surely to be understood in the light of an imminent eschaton. And as Brad says, the kingdom is not of this world, is it of the next world? I share with Brad the fact that I'm not a New Testament exegete and neither am I a theologian. So I'm reluctant to go on about this too much, but I'd be interested to know what the perspective of others is on these questions. I'm not sure, though, that placing Jesus' teaching into an eschatological frame was a later imposition performed with the intention of avoiding the admittedly difficult content of his ethical prescriptions. So I don't think this eschatological dimension is just an excuse. Now, since I've inadvisedly waded into the murky waters of theology, I'm emboldened to wonder, in conclusion, whether there might also be an additional theological consideration here. Brad's overall thesis, while certainly fitting into the decline narrative, could have told an even less hopeful story. This is because of the implication that living a life of holiness and sanctity remains a live possibility for all, and that the Protestant reformers were mistaken to attack, quote, works righteousness and notions of sainthood. I'm not so sure. And certainly from the perspective of the reformers, it might be said that Brad's argument has a tinge of Pelagianism to it. So, having gratuitously accused Brad both of consequentialism and Pelagianism, it's time to stop. Brad's argument is characteristically bold and uncompromising, and in my view offers both a substantial defence of a particular form of decline narrative and a correspondingly significant challenge to a dominant progressivist macro narrative. I'm sympathetic to its overall thrust, and I've offered this rather hastily conceived response in the hope that the argument might be clarified and further strengthened. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this wonderfully rich response. In a minute, I'm going to bring all the panelists in. But Brad, I wonder if you'd like to respond to one or two questions. I think that's probably the time we have now. Well, one or two of the things that Peter has raised.
5, but super quick, okay? I promise. Audience, whoever wants to understand the present. Same audience for Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, the audience for my book. Second, could Taoism or Marxism have things to say that overlap with the concerns here? Absolutely. Neither one had the same actual historical shaping influence of where we are today. It wasn't Taoism that shaped contemporary modern world, or Buddhism, for example, right? The elimination of desires also very much overlap with Jesus' ascetic message, but historically inconsequential for the Anthropocene. I'm not a consequentialist, nor is my argument consequentialist, except in the trivial sense that I think all human actions have consequences, regardless of the implicit or explicit meta-ethical convictions informing. Deontological ethics have consequences, virtue ethics have consequences, consequentialist ethics have consequences, and all human actions have opportunity costs. So if I'm going to the mall buying stuff, I'm not feeding the hungry or visiting the imprisoned, for example. I'll leave it at that. That's 3. I mean, I have much more to say. Oh, by the way, I don't think I'm a Pelagian, because I think it's possible for people actually to do what Jesus said, given, of course, the infusion of God's ever-present and available grace for those who accept it. So, I don't think Dorothy Day was, a proud, vain works righteousness worker for 45 years in the slums of New York.
That's a good point to stop and to bring all my panelists in. While my other panelists are thinking about questions or issues that they might want to raise, I'll bring a question. Actually, I have a hand from Christine. So please, Christine, go ahead.
Yes, I thank you both, Peter and Brad, for your presentations. I do want to pick up Peter's question about asking you, Brad, to dig a little bit into the criteria that you are presupposing in your narrative. I can say for one that your actual project of a genealogy of modernity is actually a modern project that can be traced to the early 20th century, when Weber and Troeltsch and others tried to construct or reconstruct pathways or trajectories from the Middle Ages to modernity in order to explain modernity. So I would volunteer that criterion of at least one criterion of you participating in a modern project in order to make an argument for a genealogy of decline. But I was hoping that you could shed more light, as Peter asked you to, on the criteria or the values driving your genealogy.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. No problem with that at all. I mean, obviously, in anybody doing a project like this now or at any point in the 20th century is participating in a modern project, insofar they're doing it in the modern period. I don't see that's substantial or significant or an issue. What I want to try to explain is how we've arrived at the current global environmental situation that we face. And the criteria are whatever contributes most powerfully and most convincingly to understanding the situation we're in is what I'm after. And I want to get balance right. I want to get the emphasis right. If someone says to me, you know what, you really underestimated pre-modern India. It's all kinds of complicated interactions, and you really have to take on board, the way that the British interacted with India under the Raj and so forth. Good, then let's revise it and do that. So completely subject to all revision in those terms. As I said at the outset, I am not at all invested in whether or not this happens to match up with some intellectual historical typology or criteria, what Troeltsch is doing or Spengler's doing or Nietzsche is doing or Foucault's doing. It doesn't interest me. I'm a historian who happens to find this particular methodology to be fruitful.
So just to get back to Christine, am I right to hear that you're trying to raise the point that perhaps there's a modern way of approaching what Brad is trying to understand, and then there might be other ways that are less constrained by the modern? Is this kind of where your question is coming from, or maybe I misunderstood?
Yeah, I'm just really curious in kind of a metacritical or a critical dimension. I think, Brad, if I'm hearing you correctly, there are all sorts of disclaimers that you're not doing not doing any kind of meta reflection on your own work. And I think that as responsible scholars, and especially as theologians, I don't know about historians, I'm not a historian, we are always engaged in metacritical reflections on why we're doing what we're doing and for what reason as part of our methodology. And I heard a lot of disclaimers, and I'm curious about why the Historical Guild is so resistant in providing metacritical reflections on what is.
Oh, okay. Can I respond to that? Can I respond to that? 'Cause I didn't understand that's what you were asking. I studied philosophy, nothing but philosophy, for 3 years. And I have been a practicing Catholic in the overwhelmingly secular academy for now over 25 years. So self-reflective, metacritical self-awareness is something that I would say I'm intimately acquainted with. Indeed, it's a kind of daily accompaniment to my career. What do you want to know? Epistemologically, I'm a critical realist. Evidence really can tell us things about the past. There are all kinds of modern disciplines that didn't exist before and have increased our knowledge in all kinds of ways, in ways that were absolutely not part of either the ancient or the medieval or the early modern worlds. I think we should take account of those. I don't think that, of course, we should naively accept everything as if scientists don't have presuppositions and so forth. So I also directed the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study for 5 years and was exposed to scholars and scientists in all disciplines presenting on their specialized research all the time. So thinking about the relationship among the findings of the natural sciences, the presuppositions and character of different strands and traditions within the social sciences, and the more traditional as well as postmodern humanistic traditions of scholarship and inquiry are, I deal with those all the time. But again, part, not all by any means, but if one focuses on those things, one starts to do a very different kind of endeavor altogether. I don't want to do that endeavor. This is a self-critical, self-aware, modern historical project trying to understand specifically the global environmental situation that we face, aware of any and all relevant criticisms. Please bring them on. I'm only at the beginning of this is why I want to do it now. So that, if there are really substantive criticisms, I can see what they are. But what it is not is, how can I put it? Humanists talking among themselves about who's being more self-critical and what the theoretical presuppositions of this, and you're really presupposing this and not, and so forth. I find that tiresome, and I find it at a certain point unhelpful.
Peter, thank you, Brad. Peter and Darren, are your points connected to this conversation, or are they unrelated?
Unrelated.
Unrelated also.
Okay, unrelated. I think, Darren, I'll take one more point and then I'll take a question from the floor, if that's okay. Darren.
Sure. I think my question, Brad, is just how you research a book that is large enough in scale that you said it would make the unintended Reformation look like a microhistory. How do you get all that information into your head?
That's a great question. It's a great question, and but also just preliminarily, let me just say, Unintended Reformation was an insane book too. I did not set out to write that book. I mean, nobody would say, oh, yeah, I'm going to take 20 years, reflect a lot, and so see what comes up, and I'll write a analytical narrative of 500 years in ways that challenge all kinds of presuppositions. I just don't work that way. So too with this book. I will offer just a partial answer to that, which is to say that as of last December, I had the most pathetic, absolutely bare bones understanding of the ancient Near East. Let's say from Ubaid, Mesopotamian, right? Pre-pristine state, Mesopotamian culture, 4,000 years ago, up through, certainly up through the Persian Empire. And now I've not only read a ton of scholarship, but written over 80,000 words. Really, I think pretty high level. I've given it to some of my ancient historian friends, and they said, "How did you do this? You make it seem like it took us all these years, and we're still worrying about these things." Part of it is that I know exactly what I'm looking for, and I think that the experience of being a historian and thinking about long-term change over time in other respects, right, attunes me to what it is in the sky. I don't want, my concern is not, I don't want to write a comprehensive reconstructive history of the ancient Near East and its relationship to the greater Mediterranean world. I don't want to do that. But what I do want to understand, and what became incredibly important, for example, in the chapter about ancient Greece and the Roman Republic, is the extraordinarily significant role of the first formation of genuine slave societies in democratic Athens and Republican Rome, incidentally, right? There are slaves before that, but not anything like the scale. Athens shows the way, and Rome really shows how to do it. And the advent of coinage. Explicit coinage circa 600 BC on the Ionian coast has all kinds of dramatic, transformative influences about human exchange, human relationships, in ways that are overwhelmingly taken for granted, except by specialist scholars. And I don't mean numismatists. I mean people who think hard, like Richard Seaford, about the classicist Richard Seaford, about, for example, what is the impact and what disruptions does the advent of coinage and human relationships in terms of exchange of more or less, what does that mean for a world of Homeric traditional values and so forth? The anthropologist David Graeber is fantastic on this too. His book, Debt, was really influential a couple of years ago for me when I read it. So I have a chaotic method when I need to say, here's literally what I did. I don't know anything about, ancient Babylonia. I don't know anything about the ancient Near East. I just bought like 6 Oxford very short introductions. I just read them. And then I thought, okay, if I only had this much, and again, I'm trusting metacritical awareness, right? I'm trusting these are experts that were asked to write these. These aren't people that don't know anything. If I only had these, what would I write? And I wrote like 5 or 6 pages, right? Okay, obviously this is inadequate. Well, this is pathetic. This is way too general. You've got to know more. Okay. And then I just go from there. That's what I do. Now, the next couple of years, what am I going to be doing? I'm going to be up to my waist or deeper in early Christianity and New Testament scholarship, because that's really just kind of tentative at this point. Let's say that.
Yep. Thank you. This is wonderfully illuminating. And thank you.
This is all the graduate students, or if the graduate students that are listening, should not listen to this. Do not do it this way. You need to focus very specifically. Get your sources, read them. No, I'm just.
Thank you very much. I want to take actually 2 quick ones from the floor, actually, because I think these are very relevant for your argument, Brad. So one question from Ryan McDermott. In terms of your axiom that the present is the product of the past, how would you characterize Yuval Noah Harari's approach to deep history? Because it seems that he and the evolutionary anthropology he draws on are more interested in developing an anti-theological account of human persons than a historical narrative. How does your approach differ?
First of all, thank you for invoking Harari too, a book I've read and I think is dreadful. Harari, the problem with arguments like Harari's is dogmatic naturalism is the informing principle. There's not even, so anybody, my impression has been overwhelmingly that scholars that dogmatically assume naturalism is true and you don't have to account for the contingency of being are going to run into difficulties at some point or another. Harari, there are a lot of problems with, it's a really readable book. He's a terrific writer. So I think that's part of that's part of always the virtues of a book that becomes really popular like that. But I think that, and this is a crucial part of my argument, again, metacritical self-awareness. I'm very careful in the very first chapter when I'm talking about the even deeper human past, right? The question of hominid evolution. No, the keys for what really explains human behavior, right, happen in the African savannah. They're like, 500,000 years ago, or, in our pre-Homo sapiens ancestors. That's the real key. I think I can incorporate and take account of what seems relevant for that, get us to a world of hunter-gatherers differentiated in the ways that, for example, are explored in Mithens After the Ice, a global survey of hunter-gatherers between 20,000 and 5,000 BC, and make the case that it doesn't matter what form of human life undertaken in this way. There's no way people living these kinds of lives would have got us to the Anthropocene. So that's intended to be a kind of historical as well as analytical backstop two objections that say, like Harari, there are other evolutionary anthropologists from whom I learn a great deal. My former colleague, Agustin Fuentes, for example, now at Princeton, or Jonathan Marks, the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, terrific book. Everybody should read this book. What does it mean to be 98% chimpanzee? Right? It's a great book. And the answer is that it only takes 2% of the genetic difference between us and chimpanzees to account for all the differences we see between us and them. Wow, miraculous, right? We also share 70% of our DNA with bananas. I don't think anybody thinks that that explains, why we're so fruity or something. So anyway, long answer to the question. Great question. I'll just leave it there. Everybody knows me knows this. I'm a victim of my own enthusiasm. I apologize.
Thank you. Thank you for the quick answer. And just a quick one from Owen Joyce Cowlan. I took you to be, Brad, that is you. I took you to be suggesting that Christian virtues have rarely, if ever, actually been effectively hegemonic. So your argument is not a form of consequentialism and doesn't commit you to consequentialism, but is agnostic with respect to it. Now you seem to be advocating a return to some purer form of Christianity than has ever actually existed on a mass scale, and certainly does not govern the way the mass of humanity lives today. Is that a correct summary of?
I definitely think that I'm going to argue this in the book, provisional at the moment, but for the point, I don't see significant counter arguments to it. I think there has never been a Christian society in the sense of the widespread social implementation of what Jesus preached. There have been deeply Christian cultures. The Latin medieval West, I think, is one, but it wasn't a Christian society. It was marked by the same kinds of dramatic inequalities, injustices, lack of concern for human flourishing in a broad way that characterized the ancient Roman Empire. So yeah, I agree. By my light, using those aspects of the New Testament, and again, I'm not saying that these are the correct interpretations. I'm saying, looked at this way, we can understand what has transpired historically in analytically powerful ways.
And just to push you to finish off, would you account for this fact claim that you're making about there had never been a Christian society? Is it due to nature of humanity? Is it due to social organizations of beings, human beings, like some evolutionary anthropologists might explain? What kind of factors would you?
I mean, I say this, I don't say this to be flippant, but I say anybody who reads the Sermon on the Mount and reads the other things that Jesus says in the Gospels and wonders why this hasn't been more widely accepted, it's hard. What Jesus says isn't unclear. It's incredibly difficult to actually do. That's why there have been so few people that have actually tried to do it, and even fewer that have succeeded. And so, of course, it's so much more comfortable and it's so much easier. And thank goodness we have all these theologies that help us understand how it is we can be a Christian and buy a second home and fly around the world and spend our time acquiring books like this and think that this has anything to do with what it was Jesus said. This isn't giving up all your possessions. This is finding a way to accommodate Christianity in a world that, had it been accepted, would have looked radically different than anything that subsequently followed, whether in the Latin or the Greek or other traditions.